My older brother dragged me by the arm across the grand ballroom of Manhattan's most exclusive country club to meet his fiancée's billionaire father. He knocked over my glass of sparkling water in the process, not even caring as it shattered into pieces on the polished marble floor. He just wanted to humiliate me. Smirking, he shoved me forward and announced to the entire VIP table, "This is our family failure." My parents were standing right there, nodding along with polite tight smiles, adding, "We don't really brag about her." But the billionaire didn't laugh. He looked at me, froze completely, and slowly lowered his scotch glass. The color completely drained from his weathered face as he bowed his head slightly and said quietly, "So it is you. This is highly unexpected. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family member who chronically underestimated your absolute worth. I am Maya. I am 32 years old, and my entire life, I have been the profound unspoken disappointment of the Hastings family. Growing up in a massive, sprawling estate in Connecticut, my parents cared about exactly two things: their flawless reputation among the East Coast elite and their highly publicized philanthropic image. Everything we did was a meticulously calculated performance. From the luxury cars leased specifically to keep up appearances to the perfectly curated holiday cards sent to politicians, our lives were completely manufactured for a judging audience. If you didn't fit their strict, rigid mold of conventional success, you were an absolute liability. And I was their biggest liability. Tonight was my brother, Julian's crowning achievement. He was 35, a Stanford dropout turned tech founder, and the undisputed golden child who could do no wrong in our parents' eyes. He was marrying Penelope Vance, whose main personality trait was her father's immense international bank account. Lord Alistair Vance was a British venture capitalist, a ruthless billionaire who essentially owned half the global shipping industry. For my parents, marrying into the Vance family was the ultimate social victory. It was their golden ticket to the upper echelons of a world they had desperately clawed to be a part of. The rehearsal dinner was held at the most exclusive private club in New York. The ballroom dripped in old money opulence. Massive crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow over white silk linens and towering floral centerpieces. A string quartet played softly in the corner, their smooth melodies mingling with the clinking of expensive champagne flutes. I was seated at a tiny, cramped table near the kitchen's swinging doors, as far away from the elevated VIP section as physically possible. I didn't mind the isolation. I wore my simple, immaculately tailored black pantsuit, sipping sparkling water and counting the painfully slow minutes until I could slip out the back door unseen. I had no desire to participate in the charade, and I knew my family preferred me hidden safely in the shadows anyway. But Julian had entirely other plans. I didn't see him coming until his heavy hand clamped down viciously on my shoulder. Startled, I jerked my arm, and my glass of water tipped over, spilling a cold puddle across the pristine white tablecloth and splashing onto my sleeve. "Look at you, making a mess as usual," Julian sneered, his voice laced with toxic venom. He yanked me up from my chair, with enough aggressive force to make my heels stumble awkwardly on the polished marble floor. "What are you doing?" I asked, keeping my voice low and steady, trying to pull my wrist free from his tight grip. "You are going to pay your respects to Lord Vance," Julian demanded, digging his fingers deeper into my skin as he dragged me forward. "You've been hiding back here all night like a frightened stray dog. It's time you actually contributed to this family by showing some gratitude to the people funding this lavish weekend." Before I could pry his fingers off my arm, my mother suddenly materialized from the bustling crowd like a polished, terrifying ghost. Eleanor wore a custom beaded gown that surely cost a small fortune. Her face was set in that terrifying, artificial smile she exclusively used when she was absolutely furious but holding an audience. She stepped directly into my path, raking her judgmental eyes over my black suit with visible disgust. "I specifically told you to wear the designer dress I bought you. Not this cheap, masculine rag," she hissed, her voice sharp enough to draw blood. I buy my own clothes, Eleanor, I replied steadily, refusing to break eye contact. You are a complete disgrace, Eleanor continued, stepping closer until her heavy, suffocating floral perfume washed over me. You couldn't even make it through law school. You dropped out to take some boring accounting job for a faceless corporation. You have done absolutely nothing worthwhile with your life. The least you can do tonight is keep your mouth shut and not embarrass us. We are merging our legacy with a billionaire family, Maya. Do not ruin this incredible opportunity for your brother. My chest tightened with the familiar, heavy ache of her lifelong rejection. The absolute truth was she had no idea what I actually did for a living. She only knew I walked away from the prestigious corporate law track they aggressively forced upon me to choose finance, a path they considered an embarrassing sentence to middle-class mediocrity. She didn't know my perceived failure was actually my greatest weapon. Julian tightened his bruising grip and pulled me past our mother. She's coming with me, he told Eleanor over his shoulder. I want Penelope's father to see the stark contrast. I want him to know exactly how far I have risen above the bottom feeders of this family. He dragged me forcefully toward the elevated VIP tables where the most important guests sat. Penelope stood there in a sparkling white cocktail dress, looking incredibly bored as she sipped her drink. Beside her stood Lord Alistair Vance, a tall, imposing man with silver hair and cold, calculating blue eyes. He was in the middle of a serious conversation with another executive when Julian aggressively shoved me forward. I stumbled slightly, catching my balance just inches from Alistair's polished shoes. Lord Vance, Julian announced loudly, ensuring that all the surrounding tables fell completely silent. I want to introduce you to my younger sister Maya. She is our family failure. My parents and I usually don't mention her in public to avoid the embarrassment. She dropped out of school to crunch numbers in a cubicle, but we graciously let her attend tonight. Penelope let out a loud, mocking laugh that echoed in the quiet space. Oh, Daddy, this is the one I told you all about. She works in some boring back-office accounting department. She's just a sad charity case for Julian to look after. Don't let her ask you for a job. I stood tall, smoothing the wrinkles from my black suit. I did not look at the floor. I did not cry. I looked directly into Lord Vance's cold eyes, waiting for the typical pity or swift, arrogant dismissal that incredibly wealthy men like him usually reserved for invisible people like me. Instead, something truly incredible happened. Alistair Vance was holding his crystal glass of scotch. As his sharp eyes locked onto mine, his hand completely froze mid-air. The powerful, intimidating aura surrounding him vanished in an absolute instant. All the color drained rapidly from his weathered face, leaving him as pale as a ghost. He completely ignored Julian's outstretched hand, and Penelope's continued, grating laughter. Alistair slowly lowered his glass, carefully setting it on the glass table with a visibly trembling hand. The sound of crystal clinking echoed sharply in the tense silence. He took a deeply respectful step back, bowed his head slightly toward me, and spoke in a quiet, unwavering voice. So it is you, he breathed out, staring at me as if I held his entire life and fortune in my bare hands. This is highly unexpected. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. You could hear a pin drop on the polished marble floor. Julian stood with his mouth slightly open, his grip on my arm completely slackening, as his brain desperately tried to process what was happening. My mother, Eleanor, looked as though she had been physically struck. Her artificial camera-ready smile melted into a mask of pure, unadulterated confusion. Lord Alistair Vance, a man known for ruthlessly tearing apart corporate rivals before breakfast, was looking at me with a reverence usually reserved for royalty. Lord Vance, Julian stammered, trying to regain control of his carefully orchestrated humiliation. I think there is a massive misunderstanding here. This is just Maya. She doesn't belong in your world. Alistair didn't even look at my brother. He kept his sharp, calculating eyes locked securely on mine. There is no misunderstanding, Alistair said, his voice echoing loudly in the quiet room. Ladies and gentlemen, you may know her as Maya Hastings, But in my world, the world of international private equity and high-stakes corporate restructuring, she is known exclusively as MH Liquidations. She is the single most feared, respected, and brilliantly ruthless chief restructuring officer on the entire East Coast. A collective gasp rippled through the surrounding tables. Wealthy guests leaned in, murmuring frantically to each other. My mother took a staggering step back, her manicured hand flying to her chest as if she couldn't catch her breath. But Penelope Vance, completely oblivious to the massive shift in the room's power dynamic, let out another grating, high-pitched laugh. "Daddy, what are you talking about?" she whined, tossing her expensive blonde extensions over her shoulder. "She's a total loser. Julian told me everything about her. She just pushes papers in a cubicle. She's practically bankrupt and just looking for a handout." Alistair whipped his head around to face his daughter. His eyes blazed with a fury so intense that Penelope physically recoiled, bumping into the table behind her. "Shut your mouth, Penelope," Alistair barked, his voice cracking like a whip across the silent ballroom. "You have absolutely no idea who you are speaking to. You are embarrassing yourself, and you are deeply embarrassing me." He turned his back on his trembling daughter and faced the crowd, his commanding presence demanding their absolute attention. "Last year, my corporate board was hours away from finalizing a $300 million acquisition of a newly public tech conglomerate," Alistair announced. "It was fully vetted by my experts. We were ready to transfer the funds to an offshore account. But MH Liquidations intercepted the sale. She bypassed my entire corporate security team, walked straight into my private office, and proved in under 10 minutes that the conglomerate was a masterful, highly sophisticated shell game tied to an international fraud ring. She single-handedly saved my entire corporation from a $300 million loss and a massive federal indictment that would have destroyed my legacy." Alistair took a deep breath, turning his intense gaze toward my parents with absolute disgust. "While you people were apparently mocking her for dropping out of law school and working a boring job, she was actually working deep undercover. She spent years immersing herself in the gritty, unseen underbelly of global finance. She tracked down stolen corporate funds across continents and built a global network of elite informants. She is a self-made ghost who holds the power to make or break billionaires with a single audit. And you brought her here tonight to humiliate her. You are the absolute fools." The blood drained completely from Julian's face. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was waiting for the ground to hit him. Eleanor was visibly trembling, her eyes darting frantically around the room, watching the elite society she worshipped suddenly looking at her with shock and utter disdain. They realized she had been relentlessly abusing a woman of immense power and wealth. Then my father decided to make his move. Arthur Hastings had been quietly sipping his bourbon near the bar, watching the entire exchange unfold from a distance. Unlike my mother, who was driven purely by social climbing and appearances, my father was driven entirely by greed. He was a calculating man who could smell money from a mile away. Seeing Lord Vance, a billionaire tycoon, bow down to his disgraced daughter flipped a massive switch in his head. Suddenly, the father who had ignored my existence for a decade puffed out his chest and marched right into the center of the VIP section. He pushed past a paralyzed Julian and threw a heavy, possessive arm around my shoulders. He flashed his brilliant, charismatic smile at Alistair and the crowd, playing the role of the doting patriarch to absolute perfection. "Well, what can I say?" Arthur announced loudly, projecting his deep voice so everyone in the ballroom could hear him clearly. "That's my girl. I always knew she had a brilliant mind. She just needed time to find her unique path. The Hastings business blood runs deep in her veins, Lord Vance. We are a family of winners, and Maya is the absolute proof of our strong legacy." The sheer audacity of his performance made my stomach turn. For years, this man had looked right through me. He had refused to pay for my certifications, told me I was a terrible investment, and mocked my life choices at every single holiday dinner. Now, he wanted to claim my success as his own, He wanted to use my hard-earned reputation to elevate his own status in front of a billionaire and secure his place in this elite circle. I did not smile. I did not play along with his desperate charade. I violently shoved his heavy arm off my shoulder, stepping back to put a hard physical distance between us. The ballroom went dead silent once again, the tension so thick it felt hard to breathe. "Hastings' business blood?" I asked, my voice deadly calm but loud enough to reach the very back of the room. "Is that what you call it, Arthur? Is that what you call it when you secretly drained my entire trust fund to pay off Julian's massive seed capital debts?" The charismatic smile plastered across my father's face completely collapsed. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The absolute silence in the ballroom shattered into a chaotic cacophony of gasps and furious whispering. Elite society members leaned across their white silk tables, their eyes darting between my father's horrified expression and my unwavering stare. Arthur Hastings, the man who had spent his entire life projecting an image of untouchable wealth and moral superiority, looked exactly like the thief he truly was. He took a stumbling step backward, bumping into a waiter who was frozen in place. Julian opened his mouth to defend our father, but the sheer panic in his eyes confirmed every single word I had just spoken. They thought I would stay silent forever. They thought the family secret was safely buried. That was when Penelope finally lost her mind. The reality that her perfect, highly publicized rehearsal dinner had been hijacked by her fiancé's scapegoat sister finally registered in her privileged brain. Her face flushed an angry, blotchy red, clashing violently with her expensive dress. She stomped her heel on the marble floor, looking exactly like a spoiled toddler throwing a tantrum. "You are a liar," Penelope shrieked, pointing a manicured, trembling finger directly at my face. "You are making all of this up just to ruin my weekend because you're jealous. Daddy, she is crazy. She must have manipulated your security team or hacked your corporate files. I want her out of here right now." She wildly scanned the perimeter of the room, her voice hitting a screeching pitch. "Security guards, get this trash out of my dinner immediately." Lord Alistair Vance did not move a single muscle to support his daughter. He didn't signal the guards, he just watched me, his mind clearly turning gears, re-evaluating everything Julian had ever told him about the Hastings family. The billionaire was realizing that he had backed the wrong horse. I didn't even look at the security guard stepping hesitantly from the shadows along the walls. My eyes were entirely locked on Penelope. Specifically, my gaze was glued to the center of her plunging neckline. Pinned against the white silk of her designer dress, catching the light of the massive crystal chandeliers above, was a heavy ornate sapphire and diamond vintage necklace. The air trapped itself in my lungs and a hot flash of pure rage ignited in my chest. It wasn't just any piece of vintage jewelry, it was grandmother's necklace. My late grandmother had worn that exact piece to every major family event. It was her prized possession, and she had explicitly left it to me in her last will and testament. It was the only physical piece of her I had left in the world, and it had mysteriously vanished from a bank safety deposit box the week before I officially moved out of my parents' house. They told me there had been a banking error. I stepped right past my paralyzed father and walked directly into Penelope's personal space. My voice dropped to a lethal, icy calm that cut through her hysterical screaming. "Take off grandmother's necklace, now." Penelope instinctively covered the large sapphire with her hand, her eyes wide with sudden fear at my tone. "What are you talking about?" she stammered, taking a step backward until she bumped into her father's arm. "Julian gave this to me." My mother Eleanor lunged forward, grabbing my arm with trembling, manicured fingers. "Maya, stop this instant," she hissed, her voice vibrating with sheer panic and desperation. "I gave it to her. I gave it to Penelope as her something old for the wedding tradition. Julian needed a significant family heirloom to prove our long-standing legacy to her family. You never wore it anyway. It was just gathering dust in a vault. You don't even appreciate fine things." I slowly turned my head to look at my mother. I didn't pull my arm away. I just stared at her hand until she released me, shrinking back from the absolute coldness in my eyes. The absolute disgust I felt for her in that moment was suffocating. You stole my dead grandmother's jewelry, the only thing she explicitly wanted me to have, just to play dress-up for your wealthy British in-laws? I asked, my voice echoing loudly in the dead-silent room. You stripped me of my heritage so your golden boy could pretend he came from a long line of generational wealth. You let me believe it was lost just to buy Penelope's approval. Julian desperately stepped between Penelope and me, holding his hands up like a referee trying to stop a brawl before it turned bloody. Maya, please, Julian begged, his voice stripped of all its previous arrogance. The confident golden child was gone, replaced by a terrified con artist whose house of cards was collapsing. Don't do this here. We can talk about the jewelry, the trust fund, all of it, privately. Just walk away tonight. I will write you a check tomorrow for whatever you want. Please, just leave. I did not yell, I did not raise my voice. I simply reached into the inner pocket of my tailored blazer and pulled out my phone. I ignored Julian completely, stepping around his trembling frame, and locked my eyes back on the billionaire, standing rigidly beside his daughter. I tapped my screen twice, opening a highly secured digital file I had prepared weeks ago, and turned the phone, so only Lord Vance could clearly read the bright screen. Lord Vance, I said, ensuring the words carried perfectly across the entire hushed ballroom. Ask your future son-in-law what collateral he used to secure the $300 million corporate bond you gave him for his new tech startup. The suffocating silence returned, heavier and darker than before. Arthur Hastings' mouth snapped shut, the jovial, commanding patriarch act vanished instantly, replaced by the panicked, wide-eyed stare of a man caught red-handed in broad daylight. He took a slow, cowardly step backward, melting into the periphery as if trying to erase his own existence. Lord Vance did not miss a single micro-expression. The billionaire slowly turned his head, his sharp gaze dragging away from my cowardly father and locking directly onto Julian. The ambient temperature in the room seemed to plummet. Alistair was a man who had built a global empire by systematically destroying liars, frauds, and corporate parasites. He was currently looking at my brother as if he were a diseased rat that had scurried onto a Michelin-starred dining table. If Julian had secretly stolen his own sister's trust fund to cover early debts, what else had he stolen? Julian was actively disintegrating under the billionaire's scrutiny. Heavy, rolling beads of sweat broke out across his forehead, shining slickly under the glare of the crystal chandeliers. His expensive, custom-tailored tuxedo suddenly looked too big for him, hanging off his shoulders like a cheap costume. Panic seized his features. He darted forward, grabbing Penelope by the wrist with a frantic, uncoordinated motion that made her stumble in her designer heels. "We are leaving," Julian stammered, his voice jumping a full octave as he tried to physically drag his bewildered fiancé toward the grand mahogany exit doors. "Penelope, come with me right now. We are going upstairs. My sister is mit breakdown. She is delusional. She is sick. We don't need to stand here and listen to this insane garbage." Penelope dug her expensive heels into the polished marble floor, violently yanking her arm out of his frantic grasp. The reality that her perfect, highly publicized rehearsal dinner was rapidly turning into a spectacular crime scene was finally registering. "Let go of me, Julian. You're hurting my wrist," she shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly across the tables. "What is she talking about? Daddy, do something." "He's hurting me." Lord Vance did not signal his guards to help his daughter. He handled it himself. He stepped directly into Julian's path, blocking the exit like a solid wall of pure intimidation. He didn't yell. He didn't have to. He simply projected an aura of absolute, terrifying authority that rooted Julian to the spot. "You are not going anywhere, Julian," Alistair said, his voice dangerously soft, carrying a lethal edge that sent a shiver down the spines of the guests standing nearby. "You are going to stand exactly where you are, and you are going to answer her question right here, in front of me, and in front of everyone you invited to this room." Cornered, publicly humiliated, and facing the wrath of a billionaire, Julian resorted to the only defense mechanism he had ever known. He fell back on the toxic, unyielding entitlement our parents had spoon-fed him since the day he was born. He puffed out his chest, attempting to physically loom over the situation to assert his crumbling dominance. He pointed a shaking, aggressive finger at me, his face twisting into an ugly, defensive sneer. "I am the eldest son of the Hastings family," Julian shouted, his voice cracking frantically as he tried to project power. "I did what I had to do for the financial legacy of this family. I used the ancestral intellectual property and the family estate to secure my business. That land in Connecticut has been in our name for 4 generations. It is mine by right. I am the male heir." Eleanor, sensing her golden child slipping away, immediately rushed forward, nodding vigorously in agreement with his absurd confession. "He is the firstborn son, Lord Vance," she cried out, looking desperately at Alistair, begging him to understand their twisted logic. "It is his birthright to use family resources to build his empire. Maya is just a girl. She was going to waste that trust fund on unprofitable hobbies. Julian needed that capital for real business. It was for the good of the family name." Their blatant, shameless justification of theft was so deeply repulsive that I let out a sharp, genuine laugh. It was a cold, piercing sound that cut right through their pathetic patriarchal excuses. That laugh snapped the very last remaining thread of Julian's sanity. The realization that I was utterly unafraid of him, that his lifelong intimidation tactics no longer worked, sent him into a blind rage. His eyes went wide and feral. He lunged across the open space between us, raising his hand high, fully intending to strike me across the face and physically silence the woman who was dismantling his entire fraudulent existence. "Shut your mouth, you worthless little." He never finished the sentence. Before Julian could get within 3 feet of me, 2 massive men in tailored black suits materialized seemingly out of thin air. Lord Vance's private security detail moved with brutal, lethal precision. One guard grabbed Julian by the lapels of his custom tuxedo, lifting his polished shoes slightly off the floor, while the other shoved his chest backward with tremendous force. Julian flew backward, completely airborne for a split second, before crashing hard into a nearby VIP cocktail table. Silver trays, crystal champagne flutes, and massive floral arrangements shattered across the marble floor in a deafening crash as he collapsed into a pathetic, groaning heap of ruined silk and spilled liquor. I didn't flinch. I didn't step back. I simply looked down at my brother thrashing amidst the broken glass and spilled champagne, then calmly turned my attention back to the billionaire, standing beside me. I reached into the inner pocket of my blazer and pulled out my phone again. I tapped the screen, opening a highly secured, encrypted digital file I had meticulously prepared for this exact moment. I turned the bright screen outward, holding it up so Lord Vance could clearly read the official government seal, the timestamp, and the bold black text of the digital corporate bonds. I smiled warmly at the furious billionaire, delivering the final devastating blow. "He used the Connecticut estate and my grandmother's proprietary patents," I said, my voice ringing cleanly through the groans of my brother and the horrified gasps of the wedding guests. "But unfortunately for you, Lord Vance, Julian does not own a single inch of that land, nor does he own the patents." I paused, letting the silence stretch for a perfectly calculated second. "I do, and he forged my signature on your federal corporate bond documents to secure that $300 million tech startup." The revelation hit the VIP section of the rehearsal dinner like a detonation. For a terrifying, stretched second, the sheer magnitude of the $300 million fraud simply suspended itself in the air, too massive for anyone's brain to fully process. Lord Alistair Vance, a man who built his legacy on absolute risk mitigation, stared at the forged documents glowing on my phone screen. His calculating blue eyes traced the digital signatures, cross-referencing them with the corporate bonds his venture firm had underwritten. When the realization finally crystallized, the atmospheric pressure in the ballroom completely shattered. "You forged her signature," Alistair whispered, his voice stripped of its booming authority, replaced by a lethal, icy calm that was infinitely more dangerous. He looked up slowly from the screen, his gaze locking onto Julian. You collateralized my $300 million capital injection with stolen intellectual property. Julian was hyperventilating so hard he looked like he was about to pass out on the marble floor. He scrambled backward, his hands held up in a desperate, pathetic gesture of surrender. Lord Vance, please, I can explain. It's a family misunderstanding. She's my sister, we had an internal agreement. There is no agreement, I stated flatly, cutting through his frantic lies. I have already filed the preliminary fraud reports with the Securities and Exchange Commission. Your entire corporate structure is built on a foundation of federal forgery. Eleanor, who had spent her entire life carefully curating her position in high society, finally broke. The reality of the impending federal indictments and total social destruction completely overwhelmed her delicate sensibilities. She let out a high, piercing shriek, clutching her pearl necklace so tightly the strings snapped. Pearls scattered across the white tablecloth like tiny hailstones. Eleanor's eyes rolled back into her head, and she collapsed backward, fainting dead away into the arms of a terrified country club waiter. Arthur didn't try to catch his wife, he just stood there, paralyzed, his mouth opening and closing silently, like a fish suffocating on dry land. Penelope Vance yanked her diamond engagement ring off her finger. She threw it directly at Julian's face. You absolute sociopath. She screamed, tears of fury, ruining her perfect makeup. You told me you were a founder. You told me you built it all from scratch. Alistair Vance didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He simply gestured to two massive security guards, who had pinned Julian against the cocktail table. Release him, Alistair commanded. The guards instantly let go, and Julian crumpled to his knees, gasping for air. I am withdrawing my capital, Alistair announced, his voice echoing loudly across the stunned, dead silent ballroom. The corporate bond is officially voided to criminal misrepresentation. My legal team will be filing a massive civil suit against Hastings Technologies by 9:00 a.m. tomorrow, and I will be personally handing the forged documents over to the federal prosecutor. Alistair turned and walked away. He didn't look back. Penelope followed closely behind him, sobbing hysterically as her elite bridesmaids frantically gathered their silk dresses to flee the epicenter of the destruction. I looked down at Julian, who was weeping openly on the floor of the most exclusive country club in New York. I looked at my father, who was desperately trying to fan my unconscious mother. I didn't offer a single word of comfort. I simply turned around and walked out of the ballroom. I stepped out into the cool, crisp Manhattan night, leaving the burning wreckage of the Hastings legacy entirely behind me. I requested my private driver, sinking into the plush leather seats of my town car as it merged into the glittering city traffic. As I watched the towering skyscrapers blur past the tinted windows, my mind drifted back to the absolute beginning. To the quiet, terrifying night 6 months ago, when I first discovered the rot beneath my brother's golden empire. It had been a late Tuesday evening in the sprawling glass-walled offices of my private equity firm. I was working alone, the only illumination coming from the harsh blue glow of my dual monitors. As the chief restructuring officer, my job was to dissect failing corporations, analyze their debt structures, and ruthlessly liquidate their assets to recover capital for our sovereign wealth investors. I had been assigned to conduct a routine risk assessment on a mid-level tech portfolio that our firm was considering acquiring. The portfolio included dozens of promising startups, but one company continually flagged the firm's algorithmic risk parameters: Hastings Technologies. I hadn't spoken to Julian in 3 years, not since the holidays where he had openly mocked my decision to specialize in corporate liquidation. But seeing his company name cross my desk piqued my professional curiosity. Julian had always been a charismatic salesman, but he lacked the grueling, analytical discipline required to build sustainable tech infrastructure. I wanted to see exactly how he had managed to secure a massive $300 million valuation in less than 18 months. I initiated a deep dive forensic audit into his corporate structure. I dug deeper. I bypassed the standard commercial databases and initiated a secure inquiry into the federal intellectual property registries. The timeline emerged with terrifying, undeniable clarity. My grandmother had developed the predictive algorithms decades ago. She had quietly filed the patents under a blind trust to protect her life's work from my parents, whom she accurately viewed as deeply greedy and completely irresponsible. When she died, the trust was supposed to officially transfer the rights in the Connecticut estate to me. I was the only person in the family she actually trusted. I was the only one who had sat with her in her dusty study, listening to her explain the complex mathematics behind her models. But my parents had intercepted the transfer. While I was away at college, drowning in the student loans my father refused to help pay, Arthur and Eleanor had actively suppressed the execution of the trust. They had hidden the legal notifications. When the property taxes on the estate went into default, Julian swooped in. Julian, the golden child, had used his Ivy League connections to forge my signature on the trust relinquishment forms. He illegally claimed ownership of the estate, and more importantly, the highly valuable patents. He immediately transferred the intellectual property into a new corporate entity, Hastings Technologies, and used it to secure the $300 million seed capital from Lord Vance. My brother had literally stolen my inheritance, slapped a sleek tech logo on it, and paraded around Silicon Valley as a self-made visionary. And my parents had completely enabled it, desperate to maintain their illusion of generational wealth and elite status. I sat in my dark office for 6 hours that night. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. The profound, suffocating betrayal burned away every ounce of familial loyalty I had left in my body, leaving behind a cold, hardened core of absolute vengeance. They thought I was just a boring accountant pushing papers in a cubicle. They had absolutely no idea that they had just handed the keys to their entire fraudulent empire to the most ruthless corporate liquidator on the East Coast. I didn't call the police. That would have been too messy, too easily tied up in years of expensive family litigation. My parents had endless resources to hire defense attorneys who would drag the case out until the patents expired. I decided to destroy them the only way I knew how, through the balance sheet. Over the next 4 months, I initiated a shadow acquisition protocol. Using a network of anonymous corporate entities managed by my holding company, Vanguard Global, I quietly began buying up the secondary commercial debt tied to Hastings Technologies. Julian was burning through Lord Vance's capital at an alarming rate, throwing lavish parties and buying expensive real estate to maintain his image. To cover his immediate operational costs, Julian had taken out massive high-interest commercial loans from a consortium of aggressive private lenders. I bought every single one of those loans. I paid premium prices to assume the debt, legally positioning Vanguard Global as the primary lien holder against Hastings Technologies. Because Julian had used the stolen Connecticut estate and the patents as the underlying collateral for everything, my acquisition of the debt meant that I effectively owned his entire corporate infrastructure. If Julian defaulted on a single payment, or if the company was declared insolvent due to fraud, I had the immediate, uncontested legal right to execute a hostile takeover, liquidate the assets, and seize the intellectual property. I wasn't just planning to expose him, I was planning to legally repossess my entire inheritance right out from under him. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when Julian announced his engagement to Penelope Vance. It was the ultimate, arrogant overreach. He was marrying the daughter of the man he was actively defrauding, completely convinced that he was untouchable. He sent me a heavily embossed, gold-leaf invitation to the rehearsal dinner. My mother included a passive-aggressive note, instructing me to wear something respectable so I wouldn't embarrass the family in front of the billionaires. They thought they were inviting the quiet, submissive family failure to bear witness to their crowning social achievement. They didn't realize they were inviting their own executioner. The town car pulled up to the glittering entrance of the Four Seasons. I stepped out, handing the driver a crisp $100 bill, and walked into the grand lobby. My mind was sharp, entirely focused on the final execution of the plan. The confrontation at the country club was just the opening salvo. The real destruction was scheduled for tomorrow morning. I knew my parents. I knew they wouldn't just surrender. They would try to manipulate the situation. Try to use emotional blackmail and family loyalty to force me to cover up the crime. They would undoubtedly show up at my door, completely desperate, armed with lawyers and fake tears. I welcomed it. I wanted them to exhaust every single one of their pathetic defense mechanisms before I completely crushed them. I rode the private elevator up to my penthouse suite, the silence of the luxury cabin, a stark contrast to the absolute chaos I had just unleashed upon Manhattan's high society. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and walked over to my heavy leather briefcase. I opened it and pulled out the thick, legally binding documents that officially designated Vanguard Global as the sole creditor of Hastings Technologies. I laid the papers out perfectly on the glass coffee table, ensuring they would be the first thing anyone saw when they entered the room. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water, walked out onto the balcony, and looked out over the glittering skyline of the city. The trap was set. The federal authorities were already reviewing the preliminary fraud reports I had submitted earlier that afternoon. The dominoes were aligned perfectly, completely ready to fall. I took a deep breath of the cool night air. For the first time in my entire life, I didn't feel the suffocating weight of my family's expectations. I didn't feel the heavy, familiar sting of their rejection. I felt incredibly dangerously powerful. All I had to do now was wait for the sun to rise. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse suite at the Four Seasons in Manhattan. I was standing on the expansive glass balcony, savoring the crisp morning air and a perfectly brewed cup of dark roast coffee. The chaotic fallout of the rehearsal dinner still buzzed relentlessly in my phone, which I had left silenced on the marble kitchen island. Lord Alistair Vance had immediately frozen Julian's assets pending a brutal, highly publicized corporate investigation, and the lavish society wedding was currently hanging by a precarious, fraying thread. A sharp, incredibly aggressive pounding on my hotel room door shattered the morning peace. I didn't rush. I took another slow, deliberate sip of my coffee, tightened the belt of my silk robe, and walked casually across the suite to the entryway. I swung the heavy oak door open to find my mother, Eleanor, standing in the hallway. Her usually flawless hair was slightly frizzy, and the heavy, dark bags under her eyes betrayed a completely sleepless night of absolute panic. But she wasn't alone. Standing right beside her, clutching a worn leather briefcase and looking profoundly uncomfortable, was Arthur, my father, and Harrison Brooks, the Hastings family's longtime corporate attorney. This was a highly calculated ambush. "Maya, we need to come inside right now," Eleanor demanded, her voice tight with suppressed panic and lingering arrogance. She pushed past me without waiting for an invitation, dragging the bewildered attorney and my cowardly father into my private suite. Harrison Brooks offered a weak, deeply apologetic smile. "Good morning, Maya. Your parents called me in the middle of the night. They are in deep distress. We came here to find a path of legal healing for this family." I closed the door slowly, leaning against the frame. "I am not interested in a legal healing circle, Harrison. I am interested in knowing why my parents dragged you out of bed on the morning of my brother's wedding." Eleanor slammed her designer handbag onto my glass coffee table. She unzipped it with frantic, jerky movements and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. She shoved them onto the glass surface, tapping the top page with a trembling, manicured finger. "You are going to sign this retroactive deed and patent transfer," Eleanor ordered, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. "You are going to sign it right now, and you are going to date it for 2 years ago. Harrison is here to witness the signature and notarize it as a trusted legal representative." Arthur finally found his voice, stepping forward to loom over the coffee table. "If you signed this, Maya, it legally proves that Julian had your full, documented permission to use the Connecticut estate and the patents as collateral. It turns a federal corporate forgery charge into a simple family misunderstanding. Harrison Brooks nodded solemnly, clasping his hands tightly together. Maya, the law can be rigid, but family is forever. Julian made a grave error in judgment, but sending your own flesh and blood to federal prison is a burden your conscience shouldn't carry. Think of your parents. Think of the absolute shame this will bring to the Hastings name. We must protect the family legacy. I stared at the attorney, feeling a cold, heavy wave of absolute disgust. They were actually using a respected corporate lawyer to guilt-trip me into committing federal perjury to cover up a $300 million fraud. I walked over to the coffee table, glancing down at the immaculate stack of papers. I did not pick them up. I looked back at my mother, who was vibrating with sheer, terrified desperation. Why did he do it? I asked, my voice deadly calm. Why did Julian need $300 million so badly that he would risk federal prison? You and Arthur have been bragging for years about his massive tech empire. You told everyone he was a self-made unicorn founder. The pristine, perfect society facade that Eleanor had meticulously maintained for my entire life instantly fractured into a million jagged pieces. Her face contorted into a mask of pure ugly rage. She slammed both hands down on the glass table, leaning over the unsigned papers with wild, bloodshot eyes. Because there is no empire. Eleanor screamed, her voice echoing violently off the penthouse walls. The veneer of generational wealth we built is completely hollow. Grandmother let that estate go into tax foreclosure 5 years ago. She was broke, she couldn't afford the property taxes, and she refused to ask for our help. When she died, the state was weeks away from seizing the land and auctioning off her patents. Arthur rubbed his face, looking exhausted and thoroughly defeated. Julian just took the tax money to survive, Maya. He had to leverage the estate and the patents to keep his shell companies afloat. We had to maintain our image. If the country club found out we were bankrupt, we would be ruined socially and financially. Harrison Brooks took a horrified step backward, clutching his leather briefcase to his chest as if to shield himself from the sudden, unapologetic onslaught of confessed financial crimes. He looked at Eleanor and Arthur like he didn't even recognize the wealthy clients who sat in his office every single month. You let me believe my grandmother left me absolutely nothing, I said, the bitter reality settling heavily into my bones. You let me believe she died penniless and forgot about me, all while Julian was using her stolen land and her intellectual property to fund his faked luxury lifestyle and impress Penelope Vance and her billionaire father. It's a rotting house on a useless plot of dirt. Eleanor shrieked, tears of sheer panic finally spilling down her perfectly contoured cheeks. It means nothing compared to what Julian is trying to build. You are going to destroy this entire family's legacy over a rotting house and some old patents. Sign the papers, Maya. Save your brother. Save us. I stood in absolute silence, absorbing the pathetic reality of my family's existence. They were not elite, they were not royalty, they were drowning in massive corporate debt and lies, and they fully expected me to become their sacrificial life raft. I picked up my coffee mug from the kitchen island. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the bitter dark roast wash over my tongue. I walked back to the coffee table and set the mug down directly, on top of the retroactive deed transfer, leaving a dark, wet ring right over the signature line. I will not be signing anything, Eleanor, I said. Eleanor let out a strangled, desperate sob, reaching out to grab my shoulders, but I took a sharp step back out of her reach. And, since you are in a confessing mood, I continued, keeping my voice perfectly level and devoid of all emotion, let me clarify exactly how much danger your golden boy is actually in. I didn't just buy the house back from the state, Eleanor. I bought the corporate bank debt tied to Julian's shell company. I am now his sole creditor. The silence in the penthouse was absolute. Eleanor's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Arthur physically collapsed into one of my velvet armchairs, burying his face in his hands. They finally realized that they had no leverage, They had absolutely no power. The daughter they had mocked and dismissed for decades held their entire existence in the palm of her hand. Harrison, I said, turning to the terrified attorney. I suggest you leave this suite immediately, unless you want to be indicted as an accessory to federal fraud. Harrison didn't say a word. He turned on his heel and practically sprinted out of the penthouse. I looked back at my broken, weeping parents. You have exactly 2 hours until the wedding ceremony is scheduled to begin. I highly suggest you use that time to call a very good criminal defense attorney. 2 hours later, my private driver pulled up to the curb of the historic Grand Cathedral in downtown Manhattan. The sheer, unadulterated financial waste on display was genuinely staggering. Julian and Penelope had transformed the centuries-old stone courtyard into a ridiculous spectacle of fake royalty. Massive arches of imported white orchids lined the sweeping marble staircase. A 12-piece string quartet played classical music near the valet stand, where a fleet of rented luxury cars was being hurriedly parked. It was a perfectly staged theatrical production, funded entirely by stolen money and federal wire fraud. I stepped out of my car, smoothing the lines of my tailored charcoal blazer. I didn't rush. I walked up the wide marble steps with the slow, measured pace of an apex predator stepping into its own territory. As I reached the massive, intricately carved oak doors of the cathedral vestibule, a wall of solid muscle suddenly blocked my path. 3 private security contractors stood shoulder to shoulder. They wore tactical black suits, secure earpieces, and expressions of practiced intimidation. The man in the center, clearly the head of the security detail, stepped forward. He raised a massive, heavy hand and placed it firmly against my chest, physically halting my momentum. "You need to step back, ma'am," the guard ordered, his voice a low, threatening rumble. "This is a private, highly secured event. You are explicitly on the restricted list. You need to leave the premises immediately, or we will be forced to physically remove you." I glanced down at his hand, resting against my jacket, completely unfazed by his attempted show of force. Before I could instruct him to remove it, the heavy oak doors swung open. Penelope stepped into the sunlight. She looked exactly like a plastic decoration on top of a cheap wedding cake. She was buried under layers of blindingly white custom-designed silk and imported French lace. Her bridesmaids fluttered nervously behind her, carrying the massive train of her dress. When Penelope spotted me standing at the bottom of the steps, her eyes lit up with a malicious, deeply satisfied glee. This was exactly the scenario she had been hoping for. She thought she had the ultimate upper hand. "Hold on, Vance," Penelope called out to the head security guard, waving her manicured hand dismissively. "Let her stay right there for a second. I want her to see what she's missing." Penelope strutted forward, stopping just behind the line of armed guards. She looked down at me from the top of the marble stairs, her lips curling into a vicious, deeply ugly sneer. The mask of the polite, cultured socialite completely evaporated, revealing the profound prejudice and arrogant entitlement that Julian was so desperate to marry into. "I told Julian you would try to show up here and beg for a handout," Penelope sneered, her voice dripping with sheer condescension. "He warned me that you were completely unhinged, but this is just pathetic. Look at you. You actually thought you could walk into a place like this and cause a scene." She leaned forward, dropping her voice so only I and the guards could hear her. The absolute malice in her eyes was glaring. "You don't belong in spaces like this, Maya." Penelope spat, looking me up and down with blatant, undisguised disgust. "You are a complete embarrassment to Julian. You will never be part of my family's world. Go back to your boring little cubicle, where you belong before I have these men drag you to the curb." I didn't yell, I didn't flinch, I didn't even blink. I just looked at her with the cold, clinical detachment of someone observing a particularly loud insect. The Hastings family was so desperate to be accepted by people like Penelope that they were willing to strip me of my heritage, steal from our own grandmother, and throw me to the wolves. They had sold their souls to appease a family that viewed them as nothing more than entertaining charity cases. I slowly shifted my gaze away from Penelope's flushed, angry face and looked directly at the head of security. I registered the specific gold crest embroidered on the lapel of his tactical jacket. It was a crest I knew intimately. Without breaking eye contact with the massive guard, I calmly reached into my designer handbag. I bypassed my wallet and pulled out a solid, matte black metal card. It was heavy, completely unmarked, except for a small, deeply engraved gold crest in the very center. It was the exact same crest that was currently pinned to his uniform. I held the heavy metal badge up and pressed it flat against the center of his chest. The security guard glanced down, clearly annoyed, fully intending to slap my hand away. But the moment his eyes registered the gold crest and the specific serial code engraved beneath it, the air completely vanished from his lungs. The aggressive, intimidating posture melted off his body in a single terrifying second. The blood drained completely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale white. His eyes widened in absolute, unadulterated horror. He instantly yanked his hand away from my chest, as if my jacket had suddenly caught fire. He swallowed hard, his abs apple bobbing frantically, and took a sharp, highly disciplined step backward. Without a single word of hesitation, the massive man folded his body perfectly in half, dipping into a deep, subservient bow. The two guards flanking him immediately noticed his panic, recognized the badge in my hand, and mirrored his exact posture, stepping far away from the heavy oak doors. Penelope's victorious smirk shattered. She stared at the bowing security guards in total bewilderment, her hands clutching the expensive silk of her wedding gown. "What are you doing?" Penelope shrieked, her voice cracking with sudden, uncontrollable panic. "I am paying you to keep her out. Grab her, throw her off the property right now." "That is an order." The guards did not move an inch. They remained frozen with their heads bowed, absolutely refusing to look at Penelope or follow her frantic commands. I stepped smoothly past the line of terrified men and walked up to the very top of the marble stairs, forcing Penelope to take a stumbling step backward into the cathedral vestibule. I looked her up and down, taking in the trembling mess of white lace and sheer panic. "He's not going to touch me, Penelope," I said, my voice carrying a lethal, echoing authority that made her bridesmaids physically recoil. "He works for Vanguard Global Protection. Vanguard is a subsidiary of my holding company." I smiled, letting the terrifying reality of the situation crash over her. "He works for me. And as of 9 a.m. this morning, I officially acquired the commercial debt on this cathedral. I own this venue, and I am shutting this wedding down." I left Penelope standing in the vestibule, her mouth opening and closing in mute, suffocating horror as the mass of security guards officially parted to let me through. I walked directly into the grand sanctuary. The cathedral was packed with hundreds of wealthy guests, all seated in perfectly aligned wooden pews, waiting for the ceremony to begin. Julian was standing at the altar, wearing a custom white tuxedo, looking incredibly nervous but trying to project the image of a confident groom. Lord Vance was seated in the front row, his arms crossed, his face an unreadable mask of cold stone. My parents were seated across the aisle from Alistair. They both looked absolutely miserable. Eleanor was trembling, dabbing her eyes with a tissue, terrified that the inevitable explosion was about to happen. Arthur was staring at the floor, completely broken. Julian saw me walking down the center aisle, his eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated terror. He gripped the edge of the altar, his knuckles turning pure white. He looked toward the back of the cathedral, desperately hoping the security guards would rush in and drag me away, but nobody came. I reached the front of the church. The string quartet slowly stopped playing, their bows hovering awkwardly over their instruments as the oppressive silence filled the massive stone room. I walked directly up the altar steps, completely ignoring the bewildered priest, and stood right in front of Julian. "You're trespassing," Julian whispered, his voice shaking violently. "Get out of here, Maya. Please." I didn't whisper back. I turned to face the entire congregation, my voice ringing out clearly over the echoing acoustics of the cathedral. "Ladies and gentlemen," I announced, my tone crisp and perfectly professional. "I sincerely apologize for the inconvenience, but this wedding is officially cancelled." Julian Hastings's tech startup is currently undergoing a hostile liquidation due to massive corporate fraud and the forgery of federal bonds. Federal authorities are currently en route to this location. The cathedral erupted into absolute chaos. Guests gasped in horror. People immediately began pulling out their phones, texting frantically. Julian lunged toward me, his face twisted in sheer desperation. "Shut up! Shut up!" he screamed, trying to grab the lapels of my blazer. But he never reached me. The heavy oak doors at the back of the cathedral burst open. Special agents from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division flooded into the sanctuary, their badges flashing in the dim light. They moved with terrifying speed, marching directly down the center aisle. Julian Hastings, federal agents. "Put your hands behind your back." Julian froze, staring at the approaching agents with absolute, undeniable defeat. The golden child, the arrogant unicorn founder, completely shattered. He dropped to his knees right there on the altar steps, burying his face in his hands, openly sobbing as the agents secured his wrists in heavy steel handcuffs. Lord Vance stood up slowly. He didn't look at Julian, he didn't look at my weeping parents. He looked directly at me. He gave me a single, slow, respectful nod in acknowledgement of an absolute, undisputed corporate victory before turning on his heel and walking out a side door, completely abandoning the Hastings family to their ruin. I didn't stay to watch them read Julian his rights. I didn't look back at Eleanor or Arthur, who were collapsing in the front pew, entirely destroyed by the reality of their public humiliation. I walked out the side exit of the cathedral, stepping into the bright, warm Manhattan sunshine. I hailed a cab, climbed inside, and gave the driver the address to my corporate office. I had a multi-million-dollar liquidation to manage, and I wasn't going to be late. The camera slides, slowly backward, pulling out of the flashback and settling back into the dimly lit, elegant living room where I sit right now. The dark leather of my armchair feels soft against my skin. The air is cool, and the only sound is the faint, rhythmic hum of the city outside my window. I reach over and pick up my crystal wine glass. The deep red liquid swirls gently as I lift it to the light. "People always ask me how I managed to survive it," I say, looking directly into the lens. "How I stayed so incredibly calm when my entire world was actively trying to destroy me. The truth is, I didn't just survive it, I calculated it. I let them underestimate me because arrogance is the absolute best cover for a corporate audit. They thought my silence was submission. They thought my distance was weakness. They were so utterly blinded by their own massive egos that they never even realized I was quietly acquiring the debt that would lock the cage they were eager to step into." I take a slow, deliberate sip of the wine. It tastes incredibly expensive and completely perfect. "If there is one thing you take away from my story, let it be this," I continue, my voice dropping to a smooth, unwavering whisper. "Never let anyone convince you that your worth is defined by their approval. If they mock your career, if they disrespect your boundaries, if they try to use their false wealth to make you feel incredibly small, do not scream, do not cry, do not beg them to see your value." I lean slightly forward, my eyes locking onto yours with absolute, terrifying clarity. "Just step back, stay quiet, and seize the ledger because the ledger never ever lies. And once you own their debt, you hold their entire kingdom in the palm of your hand." I lean back into the leather chair, offering one last chilling, perfectly victorious smile. Cheers. The screen slowly fades to absolute black.